gremlins! I have a lot of time on my hands at the moment, and also a lot of fabric. So today, I'm going to tackle that problem by tackling my fabric stash and seeing what things I can make with some of it, and turn it from a fabric storage problem into a clothing storage problem, because honestly, I don't have enough space for either. This is my fabric stash, normally stored under my bed and in my closet. I don't have enough space for the amount of fabric I have, and I keep wanting to collect more, so I need to get some of it out of my stash and into a different storage problem, my cupboard, where I also don't have enough space for the amount of clothes I have, but shh, it's fine. I'll deal with that problem later. So first step of today is going to be going through all my fabric and figuring out which pieces have potential or I have ideas for, and then setting those aside and putting the rest of the fabric back in storage for a later date. My fabric is vaguely separated by size and color. I have 2 suitcases for large amounts of fabric, one in greens and one for all the other colors. I have a bag of mid-size fabric, a bag of fabric the size I need for scraps or patches, and a box entirely of green fabric of various sizes. It's a lot. Going into this project, I did have some idea of what I could make with my stash, so a lot of this process is searching for specific items to fulfill those ideas. I have some velvet, some flannel, some faux fur, some brocade, and a large variety of green fabrics left over from a previous patchwork project. The first day of this project was my cutting everything out day. I started with some blue and white flannel patterned with deer, mushrooms, rabbits, plants, hedgehogs, and other forest critters. This is fabric that one of my friends, the Wizard of Iz, gave me because it's a pattern that made him think of me, and I plan to turn it into a set of whimsical pajamas. First, I'm tracing out another pair of pajama pants I own onto some butcher's paper, and using that to make a pattern. I did neglect to take into consideration that these pajama pants have an elastic waistband, which is a problem I'll solve a little later on. I traced my new pattern pieces onto the fabric, then cut them out. I have 2 front panels and 2 back panels, and off camera I'll also cut out pockets and a waistband. The one problem with this fabric is that it's blue, not green, but I plan to solve that problem by dyeing the clothes I make yellow, which on top of the blue fabric should turn dark green. This will come later in the process though. As well as pajama pants, I'm also making a pajama shirt, and because I'm me, I'm using a poet shirt pattern to give this shirt very dramatic sleeves. Well, it's not so much a poet shirt pattern as measuring a poet shirt I previously made and using those measurements again, drawing the panels directly onto the fabric. The pattern is quite simple, it's all rectangles. Next up, I'm using a waistcoat I made previously to create a pattern for 2 different waistcoats I plan to make. I've made waistcoats fairly often, but never keep track of the patterns I make, so pretty much every time I have to make a new pattern. The first waistcoat of this project will be a dark green brocade waistcoat with a plain green cotton lining, which I'm cutting out now. This is a project that has been on my to-do list for months, ever since I acquired this beautiful fabric. The second waistcoat, I'm only cutting out the lining fabric for now, as the outer panels will be patchwork from a variety of different fabrics, and I'm going to deal with cutting all those out later. The lining is a simple olive green cotton. I'm making a second pajama/cozy clothing item out of the second flannel from my stash. This one is to be cut out using a 13th century tunic pattern I've used often before, as one of my off-camera hobbies is medieval garb making and wearing and medieval crafts. I've slept in my other 13th century tunics before when I was too tired to change after a day of wearing them, and they're very comfy, so now I want to make a flannel tunic. Not the most historically accurate fabric, especially given it has a subtle mossy pattern, but specifically for sleep. The next project is also medieval. I'm tracing a previous 13th century hood that the house cat made for me onto some plain dark green cotton. This hood is going to be lined in green faux fur I acquired a few weeks ago. I don't think coloured fur is particularly historically accurate, but this is going to be so warm and cozy, so I don't care. The downside of cutting out faux fur is that the fuzz gets everywhere, so after I cut out the hood lining, I had to do some quick cleanup. There was one last project I cut out, using velvet and tracing a capelet I made previously, but I forgot to actually press record, so that project will mysteriously appear in a little while. In the meantime, I need a recovery nap after cutting out fabric for several hours. The next day, I got started on sewing. I'm starting with the forest flannel pajama pants, and a set of pockets I cut out off camera after forgetting that I should add pockets until today. In the past, I've struggled with sewing pants, well, shorts, and getting the crotch seam and inseam mixed up. However, I didn't have to fear that fate today, as long pants means it's a lot easier to tell which seam is which, unlike shorts where both are similar lengths. I did have to struggle a bit to sew the pockets in place, doing one pocket by hand off camera to figure out what I was doing. The other pocket was attached via machine once I'd figured it out. This is my first time sewing full-length pants, and they were surprisingly easy. I may have to make myself more in the future. I finished the final structural seam of the pants to make them wearable, and then tried them on and ran into the issue that the pants I had traced had an elastic waistband, and these pants did not have the extra fabric to make that work. I could get them on, barely, but it was more of a struggle than I want out of comfy pants. So I went back, unpicked my side seams above the pockets, and added some extra fabric gauze to expand the waistband. Luckily, this was a fairly easy fix. I tried the pants for a second time, this time they fit correctly, and measured out a length of elastic for the waistband. What I didn't measure was the strip of fabric to wrap the elastic in, and it was only just wide enough, making the process of sewing the waistband in place difficult and fiddly enough that I did it by hand. I stretched the waistband out across my knees while I sewed, to keep from dealing with scrunching. However, I think this actually stretched out the elastic permanently, as the pants don't fit as snugly as I measured them to. They still stay up though, which is the important thing. The final step to sewing these pants was to hem the cuffs, which is quite easy. I also still need to dye them, but I'm going to wait until I've sewn the matching shirt first so I can dye both at once. So for now this project was set aside. I did fell all the raw seams off camera to make these pants last, and tested them a few times to make sure they were comfy to sleep in. They were. Ignore my hair, it's a bit of a mess. First project is done, other than the fact that I'm going to dye it, but that'll be in a few days because I want to use the weekend for that. And I could go on to do the second project made of the same fabric, but actually I want a break. So after I've had some food, because I desperately need lunch right now, I'm going to start working on a project that I completely forgot to record the cutting of the fabric for, but is a velvet capelet that I'm going to be covering in moss details. So I'm going to start creating the moss for that after I've had food. I've got a few different ways I want to make moss. First, this is the fabric it'll be on. I'm going to be making a reversible capelet that one side is this dark velvet, and the lining is this lighter velvet. I will probably regret working with velvet at some point in this project. I've got some fuzzy fabric here, as well as some textured yarn, and I'm going to make several different moss patches in a variety of sizes, colors, and textures, and then sew them onto the outer lining of the moss capelet before sewing the inner lining to it so that all the sewing marks from attaching the appliques will be hidden, basically. That way it will technically be reversible, although I probably won't wear it without the moss visible very often. So I'm going to start by cutting out some moss patches and then knitting some. The first fabric I'm cutting moss out of is a slightly textured olive green fleece, which was simple and straightforward to cut, although I only had small scraps to work with. The next two fabrics were a little more messy. I have the remaining faux fur that isn't being used to line a hood, and I have some mossy blanket fabric left over from making a cushion cover for my wheelchair, both of which shed like mad when I cut them. I made things even more messy by giving the faux fur a patchy trim to make it more textured, which of course means I, the chair, and the carpet were all covered in bits of fuzz. I had to do some serious vacuuming after this. The fuzzy blanket was a little less messy because I didn't do the same trimming to it, but I'm still absolutely coated in bits of fluff. Finally, I picked up my textured yarn and started knitting moss patches. I didn't record most of this process as it's quite repetitive, but here's the start of my afternoon of knitting. With the moss all cut out, plus some extra that I cut out off camera once I was placing it, we come to the attachment process. Here is my capelet, all laid out on the ground covered with moss patches. And I spent the next 3 or so hours sewing each bit of moss to the velvet. Luckily, sewing onto the velvet wasn't nearly as much of a pain as I'd expected and had been bracing myself for. It did get pretty tedious though, there's a lot of moss to sew down. I cut the footage up significantly so that this doesn't drag out for forever. A moss capelet is perhaps not the most everyday wear type of clothing, but it's going to be so fun and whimsical to wear for special occasions or as part of costumes. Plus, knowing me, there will be some days where I just wear it to the grocery store. It's not like I don't dress weird in everyday life. The antlers are not just for when I'm on camera, for example. I finally finished attaching the moss, and the next step is to pin, then sew this part of the capelet to the lining. The two layers don't line up perfectly, but they're pretty close, and the velvet stretches just enough to make up for the difference. This is probably the least amount of trouble I've had sewing velvet, ever. I really expected this project to be worse. I was still wiped by the end of it, but given how long it took to sew all the moss in place, I think I earned that exhaustion. The final step was to sew some ribbons in place to tie the capelet closed, and sew the straight seams together. I finished these seams by hand to make sure the stitches were all neat and the raw edges stayed hidden inside the lining. And then I can show off this wonderfully whimsical new accessory. It is the third day of me working on this project. Up till now I've only been able to manage one project a day, but today I'm going to try and change that by doing several of the smaller projects, starting with the second project using this foresty patterned flannel. We'll see how many projects I'm able to get done today before I absolutely exhaust myself. Poet shirts are luckily quite simple. My first step was to hem the bottom of the body panel, since one side was cut out with an already hemmed part of the fabric and I wanted the other side to match. From there I pinned the sleeves into place. The sleeves are just rectangles right now, so other than the pattern of the fabric, which I forgot to pay attention to, it doesn't really matter which side is pinned to the body. I sewed those two seams, then got to work on the sleeve cuffs, which will turn big rectangles of fabric into cinched and dramatic poet sleeves. The fabric had a wide hem at one side, so I just cut that hemmed part out and used it for my cuffs, saving myself time. I measured the fabric to the width of my hand so I can get my hand into the sleeve, then cut it, slightly too small, so I can get the sleeve over my hand, but it's a struggle. That cuff then gets pinned to either side of the sleeve, and the fabric in between gets pleated until it fits along the length of the cuff. This then gets repeated on the other sleeve, both of which are sewn in place. I love how easy it is to turn a rectangle into a dramatic sleeve. I should make more poet shirts. Their only downside is not being able to layer a jacket or hoodie comfortably over the sleeves. The final on-camera step of this shirt was to sew the side seams from the bottom to cuff, making it a wearable shirt. Like I did with the matching pants, I felled all the raw inner seams off camera to make it safe to wash and wear many times. But until I get to the dyeing, this shirt is done. The next project I work on is a brocade waistcoat, another fairly easy project. The way I make waistcoats nowadays is to sew the lining and the main fabric panel to each other, leaving one edge unsewn so I can turn them from inside out to right side out. I then whip stitch each panel together to make a neat two-layered waistcoat with no visible raw edges. So the first step is matching lining panel to outer panel and pinning each together before sewing. For me, waistcoats are more of a summer wardrobe thing than a winter one, because they are sleeveless layering pieces so I can layer without dying of heat. They do work in winter as long as I wear enough thermal long sleeves under my shirt, and I have been wearing this waistcoat around under several layers of flannels and hoodies, but it will truly shine when the weather warms up. Waistcoats are also really gender affirming for me, especially when they are fitted in a way that makes my chest look flatter, which this one is. All in all, a good wardrobe staple. I sewed the panels individually on camera, but did all the whip stitching of the panels together off camera, since hand sewing isn't nearly as satisfying to watch. The waistcoat is now sewn together. I still need to finish the raw edges at the bottom and back, especially since they don't actually match up, so I will need to do a little bit of trimming. And I will need to add buttons, which I'm not looking forward to, but I'm going to do that after lunch. For now, I need a break to eat some food. I returned after some pasta to pin the remaining raw seams so that all those edges are hidden inside the lining. This also involved cutting away the extra fabric from the back panels, since my DIY patterning did not make equal seam lengths. When pinned, I sewed carefully along the pin line. Sometimes I'll finish this type of seam by hand, but today I decided to use my machine and make things go quicker. Next, I went through my button collection, choosing a couple candidates and landing on some fancy brassy gold ones, which I think will go excellently with the green. I cut myself some buttonholes, sewed around the raw edges of the holes, made sure my buttons fit, then marked out the button placement and sewed them down as well. I don't like sewing buttonholes, but it's a necessary part of the waistcoat process, and at least now it's more enjoyable now that I know buttonhole stitch, and I'm not trying to whip stitch the raw edges of making a mess. And huzzah! We managed 2 projects in one day! And even though it was only early afternoon, I'd done all that I could manage for the day and went to play video games in bed. I miss the stamina for projects I used to have. Now we come to the weekend and dyeing day. First, I borrowed the Housecat's dye pot, which is not food safe, and set up an induction stove in my shower so that I can empty the pot down the drain when I'm done. I waited patiently, and not so patiently, for the water to heat up enough, then added yellow dye along with salt vinegar and dish soap, and my pajamas. The yellow looked promising, but brighter than I'd anticipated on the white parts of the pajamas, so I added some dark green and gave it another soak, hoping that green forest paraphernalia on a dark green background would be more to my tastes. Those were then left to rinse, then dry, and the results will be revealed at the end of the video. We return to me cutting fabric out on the kitchen floor. It's finally time to work on the patchwork waistcoat, a project that I started avoiding out of fear because while patchwork is fun, it also takes a while. I have a tiny square canvas I'm using as my template for each patchwork square, and I spent the morning cutting squares out of different green fabrics and laying them out on my lining piece to make sure every inch was covered. Most of these fabrics were bought for a different patchwork project, a patchwork skirt I sewed on the channel a few months ago. Now I'm figuring out what to do with all the leftovers, and more patchwork seemed like a good answer. While I was cutting out all these fabrics, I was chatting with the bearded gremlin and watching David Attenborough documentaries through Discord together, a fun way to spend a Monday morning. When all the patches were cut out, I pinned them in strips off camera, then began to sew those strips together. Luckily, I didn't have to worry about finishing all these seams, as they'll all be safely enclosed by the lining layer. I have a variety of fabric involved, all of it secondhand. Some cloth napkins, a tablecloth, some pillowcases, and various fabrics that were rolled up with a rubber band from someone else's stash. I spent 2 years collecting all these fabrics for one project, and now I get to use them for whatever else I want. The only problem is thinking of more things to do with them. With each strip of patches sewn down, I went to my ironing board and pressed all the seams flat, before pinning the strips together into panels. The fact that some of my fabrics are cotton and some are polyester makes ironing them flat a little tricky. I don't want to accidentally melt anything. With the panels pinned together, I sewed along those pin lines. My piles of patches have turned into vaguely waistcoat panel-shaped sections of fabric. What else do you think I could make with this selection of patchworkable fabric? I'm thinking a pillowcase, a doona cover, and maybe some pants or overalls, but I'd love other suggestions as well. Maybe I'll make a dedicated patchwork video. Once I'm sewing, I really like patchwork, I just find it intimidating in the planning stage. And I'm back to the ironing board again, trying my best to press all my seams flat before the next stage of the process. It helps if you turn your iron on. There's one fabric in particular, which was once a polyester tablecloth, that just does not want to behave. But I got it behaving enough to move on to pinning my patchwork onto my lining fabric. The patchwork section is larger than the lining panel, but my plan is to sew the two together, then trim off all the excess before I turn it right side out. This way was easier than trying to make the patchwork panel exactly the size and shape of the end result. Using a lining makes my patchwork so much easier than the last time I sewed patchwork. I don't have to finish any of my inner seams, and I have the exact model of size and shape I'm aiming to create. It's great. Again, when I'd finished sewing and trimming the panels, I whip-stitched them to each other off camera. I did, however, take photos of the process, and here's a quick try-on in the mirror. The next step is once again conquering buttons and buttonholes. This time I'm using the green buttons that I decided not to use on the last waistcoat. These buttonholes were a little trickier because each one was cut on a different fabric that frayed differently as I was trying to finish the edges with buttonhole stitches. The buttons, however, were easier as they are traditional 4-hole buttons rather than the buttons with a little thing on the bottom to sew through. I don't know the terminology. And with those 3 buttons sewn, it's on to the last day of sewing, hopefully, and I've got all my pieces pinned and laid out on the floor ready. I'm hoping to finish the sewing today. I have 2 more projects left to sew, and I was planning on spending all day on them, but I spent the morning fighting with storage space to have enough room on my phone to film, so I'm hoping I still have enough time. These are both medieval-themed projects, and they're both projects that I've sewn the pattern before, so hopefully they should be fairly simple and straightforward. I started with the hood, sewing a seam down the back of the faux fur panel first. I thought the fur might be a little too thick to go through my sewing machine, but luckily it wasn't, making this much quicker for me than hand sewing would have been. Next, I sewed the seams of my main hood. A hood would have historically been made out of wool, because wool is semi-waterproof and when it does get wet, it doesn't get cold. Good things for when a hood is to be worn in bad weather. However, nowadays wool is expensive and I don't have any in stash, so cotton will have to do. With the main hood sewn together, I needed to hem the edges, first pinning them. Some parts of the hem going over my seams were such thick fabric that I needed to hand crank my sewing machine through to avoid breaking the needle. The rest of the hem was fairly simple though, and the thickness of the fabric makes me hope that this will be a fairly sturdy garment. With both sections individually done, the next step was positioning the faux fur lining inside the hood, and pinning the extra that will frame the head opening down around the raw edges. I sewed the fur to the hood by hand, making things easier for myself, tacking the edge around the edge of the hood opening. It may not be the most historically accurate, but I do think it looks cool. And at last we reach our final project. This tunic pattern is one I've sewn many times before, so I didn't hesitate before diving in. First, I sewed side gores, triangle pieces of fabric to make the rectangle of a body more trapezoid, to the side seams. Usually I hand sew my tunics, so doing this by machine felt so quick. Next I sewed the 2 panels of the sleeves together at the elbow seam, for each sleeve. This is supposed to make the sleeves appear more fitted, but I think I measured wrong, my sleeves are still quite loose. That's good for pajamas though, so I'm not complaining. With the body and sleeves done individually, I then pinned the sleeves to the body following the edge of the gauze where the sleeves and gauze overlap. While the pattern is historically accurate, reconstructed by one of my friends, my fabric choice is not. This is not designed to be accurate garb, but a fun, cozy thing to wear in regular life. It's a patterned flannel, not plain linen, wool, or what I can afford in the modern day, cotton. With sleeves attached, the final structural seams are from cuffs to hem down the sides, to join the front and the back of the garment. Nice long seams like this are really satisfying to sew, especially when I position my pins perpendicular to my seam line so I can just sew over them without an issue, and I don't have to pause to take them out. The sleeve cuffs are too narrow to hem on my machine, so I did those by hand while waiting for my dinner to cook. So the last thing I sewed on camera as the light faded was the hem of the skirt. And with that, we reach the reveal. There's a lot to show off in this video. I finally finished all the projects. There are a lot of them in this video, and I need a break from sewing now. But I'm actually so happy with all the results. I've been wearing them as I finished them, so most of these have already been worn around and are very comfortable. Both the vests I really enjoy the fit of, and I think they go great with some of my outfits. This is fantastic, and so fun to wear, very whimsical and mossy. The pajamas are extremely comfortable and nice and warm for winter sleeping. I might need to do a second video of these because having done all this and put the fabric away again, the bits that I didn't use, my fabric stash is still out of control, so I think I will come back and do this again. I just need a break from sewing first. But thank you so much for watching this video. Please let me know which of these projects you liked, and if there's any other things I should make with random pieces of stash. And yeah, I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, bye! I've sewn the waistcoat together, and this is how it is looking.
Your attention,
Oh,
please. Your
fuck's
attention,
sake.
please. Testing of the fire and evacuation alarms.